a genetic counselor and coordinator of the Duke Down Syndrome Clinic. Prior to becoming a genetic counselor, she earned her PhD in cognitive psychology from UNC Chapel Hill. She spent several years doing research in cognitive neuroscience. She later chose to change her career path and become a genetic counselor, yay, so she could work more closely with patients and families. She finished her master's degree in genetic counseling at UNC Greensboro, joined the team at Duke in 2014. And in her role at Duke, she enjoys being able to provide genetic counseling and support for families in the clinic while still being closely involved in research. And then Jane Ann Baker, second speaker from Duke. She's been a genetic counselor at Duke for the past 8 years. She works in the Down Syndrome Clinic and I think mostly focuses on the Down syndrome research studies. You may have seen her at the Buddy Walk at our last time at the Freedom Park. She had a table there, so she may be a familiar face to some of you. So, all right, over to Sarah and Jane Ann.
Thank you very much. So we're very excited to talk with you all today about the research that we're working on at Duke right now. So today I'm going to give you an overview of kind of where we've been at in the past with this type of research, where we're at currently with our currently enrolling studies, and then where we're planning to go in the future and what our interests are. So generally, the goal in our research program is to improve the healthcare and quality of life for individuals with Down syndrome. And our research program is, the PI or principal investigator is Dr. Priya Kishnani. She started our Down Syndrome Clinic in 1995 with Dr. Gordon Worley. And the majority of our research is funded by the Anna's Angels Foundation, and also we're working closely with Roche, which is a pharmaceutical company that's sponsoring our clinical trials that we're working on. So just want to give you kind of an overview about cognition in Down syndrome. So when I say cognition, that really refers to lots of different types of functions. So these can include things like being able to remember things, pay attention, solve problems, being able to use language, like understanding language, being able to express language, and things like that. So these are all functions that are obviously very important for quality of life, performance in school, interaction in the community, and all of those types of things. So what we're really interested in investigating are whether certain types of interventions can help to enhance these different types of cognitive functions in children and adults with Down syndrome. So really there's kind of two main types of interventions. So the first type is a behavioral type of intervention. So we're involved with one study that uses these computer programs. So CogMed is the computer program where kids will kind of play these little computer games. And so the goal of these games are to kind of train kids to be able to improve their memory and attention and things like that. And then the second type of intervention are the medication studies. So the majority of the studies that have been done so far have been on using the medications donepezil, which is also known as Aricept, as well as rivastigmine. And so those medications, they both work on the same neurotransmitter systems in the brain, or the chemicals in the brain that help it function. And then more recently, there have been studies looking at other types of medications that affect different types of systems, like memantine, GABA inhibitors. Those are different types of medications. But all of these different neurotransmitter systems or chemicals have been found to be different in individuals with Down syndrome.
Oh, I'm sorry, just a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Memantine and the GABA inhibitors, do they work on different parts of the brain than the first two?
So they work on a whole different system. So memantine works on NMDA receptors, I believe, which are kind of found throughout the brain in different circuits of the brain. So nothing is kind of localized in one particular part of the brain. It's really kind of more complex circuitry in the brain and kind of how it functions. And they have different roles, different kind of complex roles in different cognitive functions. So just to give you a little overview of randomized controlled trials are really kind of the ideal study design for these types of drug studies. So in these types of designs, you have a study population that we then randomize to either receive a drug or a placebo, which, as Dr. Spence had described, is something that looks and tastes just like a drug, but doesn't have the active ingredient in it. So then what we do is measure before and after the treatment in both groups, different cognitive functions. So the goal is to see if those individuals receiving the drug have more improvement compared to those receiving the placebo. And so this differs from what we call an open label type of design. And in that type of design, participants just get the drug, so there's no placebo. So in that type of design, everyone knows they're receiving a medication and a treatment. So as Dr. Spence had described, that can be kind of more vulnerable to bias in that type of study design, because that's particularly in measures where that involve sort of more subjective measures, such as asking for parents' report about how their child's cognitive function is working. So those type of designs, so that's why the randomized control trial is really kind of the ideal way to approach these medication trials. So I just want to give you a kind of an overview of where we've been in the past. So at Duke, our group's been involved in these types of studies for the past 15 or so years. So Dr. Kishnani published the first clinical trial on adults with Down syndrome using donepezil. And so this was an open label design, so no placebo group in this one. But the original results suggested that maybe there could be some improvement on adaptive functioning, which includes things like daily living skills, communication, socialization, and things like that. And then in the 2000s, Jim Heller in our group published several studies investigating these medications with children. And Jim, he passed away in 2014, and he was really a leader in the field in cognition and Down syndrome, and conducted many of these studies in our group with children. And more recently, the trials have expanded to the different types of medications, like I mentioned. And so these are all currently ongoing with new types of interventions now. So what did they find in these studies? So generally, they found some evidence that there could possibly be improvement in some different cognitive functions. Expressive language is one area we're really interested in. It has kind of shown, I think, one of the more areas showing promise in these trials, where children might have some improvements in their expressive language, as well as attention, memory, and adaptive functioning. There's been some evidence for some improvement in those areas. However, it's really important to understand that there's a lot of variability across the studies in terms of whether the studies did find a significant effect or not. So why the reason for this variability? So some of the earlier studies were, as I explained, the open label type of study, so no placebo group, could be more vulnerable to bias and things like that. The studies differ in terms of the study population, so some had kids and some had adults, which could certainly differ in their response to medications. Sample size is a huge issue in these different studies, and one of the big questions that we've been thinking about are whether there could be potentially a subset of individuals who are more responsive to these medications, whereas when you take a whole group together and average them all together, we don't see any significant differences between groups. But it might be that there are a smaller set of individuals who are more responsive, and we're just not able to detect it with the current design. So having bigger samples is really important to be able to look at that. And then finally, the studies can use different varying cognitive measures. And so a really important question is, are we actually using the right cognitive measures? Are the measures that we're using the best way to actually capture any changes that these children are showing with the medication? And so that's a study that, that we've been investigating with Roche on a non-drug study. So this is a clinical trial that doesn't use medication, but the goal is to just try to understand what are really the best measures to use for use in clinical trials in Down syndrome. So the goal is to try to find measures that are going to be reliable over time, that are going to be suitable for the Down syndrome population, nothing too difficult, too easy, and just to characterize kind of how variable the children's responses are on these types of tests. So we worked with Roche. They recently published a study on 90 teenagers and adults that was a national or multinational study. So this study that was published kind of showed a profile of the different cognitive measures and what would be kind of recommended or not for the future clinical trials. So will certainly be very helpful in designing future studies. And we're currently involved in a study on kids ages 6 through 11 to look at these similar measures. So we have completed enrollment on that study, and right now we're just currently collecting data on the participants who are enrolled in that study right now. And I am going to turn it over to Jane Ann at this point to tell you some more about our current studies that are enrolling.
multi-pack.
Maybe just hold it.
I was going to say, mine's not that long, so I'll be quick. Anyway, I'm Jane Ann Baker, and I've been working at Duke with clinical trials for 8 years, and I've worked with Aricept and rivastigmine, and now I'm working with the Roche clinical trials. And I just want to, just a quick plug, thank you, because we've had great response from the Charlotte group in participating in our studies, drug, non-drug. I mean, it's really been wonderful, and we really do appreciate it. And obviously, Anna's Angels supports a lot of our research, and many of the early trials that we did do at Duke were very small sample size because we didn't have a lot of money. I mean, that's always the caveat, right? Money. And so because Roche is now working with this, they've developed a drug, you know, it's nice to have a company like that, you know, provide money to actually develop a drug, because it costs millions and millions and millions of dollars to develop a drug and run these studies. But without participants, that money goes nowhere. So we appreciate everything that you all do to support us in this, and, you know, hopefully we'll continue that partnership. But we've done all of these trials and are doing them at Duke now. And thank you, Dr. Spence, for that great summary, because that helps a lot with what I'm going to be talking about. So we did do the phase 1 study with adults for the Roche trial, and that has completed. Again, it was a fairly small sample size, but the idea was safety. So we completed that. Safety was excellent. And actually, I'm going to go on to actually how do I advance on this thing? Oh, thank you. This one? Oh, there we go. Oh, no, back. There we go. I got it. So this is the drug that we're actually working with Roche to investigate. It's got a number, RG1662, because it's still proprietary, and so we don't have you know, detailed information on the chemical makeup of the drug, but basically we are investigating cognitive functions for Down syndrome. Somebody who is interested in how this works, I did include a little bit of a blurb there. Again, most of these are basically looking at neurotransmission in the brain and how we can improve that, and this is just another drug that they developed to attack a specific system within the brain that they feel is inhibited in Down syndrome. The point of the studies is obviously safety always. You know, phase 1 is all about safety. Let's make sure it's safe in adults who don't have Down syndrome. Then we progress to adults who do have Down syndrome. The safety actually for this drug was excellent. I was actually amazed myself, having worked with Aricept and Exelon. The safety was excellent. So that we did go on to the phase 2 portion, which we've also now fully enrolled, and we should be analyzing data sometime this summer when the last participant finishes, and that was adolescents and adults. And again, safety, they did an interim safety analysis, which was also excellent. We're currently now on phase 2 with children. Because the safety analysis in phase 2 with adults and adolescents was so good, we were given permission by the FDA to proceed to children. And part of the reason doing 6 to 11 was so important to the Roche team was because that's where we feel we're going to get the biggest impact of this particular drug in improving cognition. So we have one person now who is probably about halfway through the 6 to 11 group. So we are still recruiting for that, as I mentioned. We're probably at Duke going to do a total of 4 because there's approximately 9 centers in the U.S. that are doing it. So they're looking at initially 36, but again, the safety has been great. And so the FDA has now given them permission to do even more young adult or adolescent or 6 to 11-year-olds. So we're increasing our numbers now. So Duke may be doing actually a screening and evaluating more than 4 people. So just keep that in mind if you have any friends that are 6 to 11. And the nice thing about drug trials with a big company like Roche's, they pay everything. It's wonderful, travel, hotel, food. It really is a nice perk, and you typically also get a stipend for every visit to help cover expenses that, we may not even think about, like pet sitting, childcare. They're just different things, expenses that we all incur when we have to travel to a center and do these studies. So this, again, is just basically talking a little bit about the phase 2 with the adolescents and adults. It was called Clematis. And again, it's closed to enrollment, and data analysis should begin this summer. That was, and now you know from Dr. Spence exactly what all this means, randomized, which means the people who either took the placebo or the drug, totally random, no one knew. Double blind, we didn't know, they didn't know, nobody knew who was taking the drug. And we did use a placebo, and they were on the medication for 26 weeks. And we have completed enrollment with that, and it's been completed throughout the world, actually. And so they're going to be doing the analysis this summer. This just gives you a basic idea, and this is typical of what we're doing with the 6 to 11 group as well. So there's a screening visit, and the screening visits for any of these drug studies or any kind of an intervention study is really important because you get a sense of what you're going to be expected to do during a study. And that can be very important because every study is different. This study, particularly with 6 to 11-year-olds, we're expecting a lot from 6 to 11-year-olds. Blood draw, EKG, EEG, because it's all safety, safety, safety. The testing that they do with our clinical psychologist is only, for the child is only about an hour and a half of the entire day, and the rest is safety procedures. But if your child can't tolerate those safety procedures, then we really can't, they can't participate in the study, which is unfortunate. So the screening visit really gives us that opportunity for them to experience all of these different safety measures that they're going to be expected to do during this study. And then the baseline is really where we start gathering our information. Then they're on the drug, and those are the different possibilities of doses that they can be on for 26 weeks. Then we do a follow-up 1 and a follow-up 2. And why are those follow-ups important? They're important for a couple of reasons. One is obviously, again, safety. You go off the drug, it's still in your system for a short period of time, but we want to make sure you're safe for several weeks after you're off the drug, that there's no problems. But also because we're looking at cognition, and the big question is, do you have to, everyone always asks me, is my child going to have to take this drug for the rest of their life? Well, we don't know the answer to that. So by doing the follow-up 3 to 4 weeks after and following up on the cognitive testing, it gives us some sense of, have they retained the skills? Are they dropping off? Are they continuing to improve? So that's a really important aspect of that. And I know a lot of people think, there are a lot of visits. Why are we coming for all of these visits? Why do we have to do this? Well, again, it's safety, 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 safety at every visit. And that's whenever you're on a drug, that's really important. But there are different times that it's important to capture how a child is, are they learning or not learning? And as Sarah mentioned, it's very difficult to prove that these drugs or any intervention are actually working, particularly with the 6 to 11 and adolescent group. It's very difficult. So the more we interact and work with them, hopefully the more we learn over time. Long list of exclusions. Again, it's all about safety, so we want to make sure before you even participate. I spend hours on the phone with families. I'm sure Kim can tell you how much time we spend trying to make sure that your child is going to be safe before you ever walk through the door. The other thing that I want to talk about is our MRI study. Again, because we're talking about improving cognition today, this is another study at Duke. It's not a drug study. It's not an intervention study. But what it is trying to better understand the brain of a child or adult with Down syndrome. So for this study, we're doing 10 to 17. So we're doing basically adolescents. But we're doing an MRI, and again, we're trying to understand the brain structure in children with Down syndromes and how possible differences in the brain could relate to their cognitive abilities. And nobody's done this. So this is really exciting. Because, there's so much about the brain we don't know. So just doing an MRI and trying to see if there's any changes there, and then we're doing a number of cognitive tests to see if there's any relationship between the two is really important. And so, again, hopefully benefit to you at the time this is done. Well, you do get an MRI study of your child's brain, which is, handy, I guess. No, it is. And you do get the cognitive testing. The person who's doing that cognitive testing will give you information about that. That some people can't, it's not completely relatable to an IEP, but some people have taken them to their IEPs. It is currently enrolling. And again, someday we hope that this information might help us with specific therapies for improving cognition. So a little bit more, one thing I've learned about the 6 to 17 group, they love Minions. I don't know. Okay. So anyway, we have videos that they can watch while they're watching the MRI, and Minions seems to be a favorite. And then the other thing, the main thing about this is, and why we've had real difficulty in recruiting for this study, they have to lie still. And that is a challenge, believe me. And they have to do an MRI. So we have a mock MRI that they can try and see if that will work. But they do have to lie still. It's a challenge. So just, but it's a really important study. We've had a lot of trouble recruiting because it is an MRI. The kids are scared. I mean, we understand all of that. But if you have or know anyone that's interested at all, it really is an important study, and we're really excited about the work there. And again, this is sponsored by Anna's Angels, so there's not quite as much money as there would be for a Roche study, but we do what we can to help people out. And if you come to our area, there's all these great things to do. I'm all about food, so there's a couple of mention there about how there's great food in Durham. There's Sky Zone, there's the Duke Gardens. I just heard about a place called Wheels from one of our families. So some of the MRI study may only take a morning, and then look at all these great things you can do in the afternoon while you're there. Anyway, and I will be in the room in the back to talk to you more specifics about the studies after we're done today.
Just a quick one, is that just a one-time thing then?
It is a
One-time,
one-time.
is it?
It is a one-time.
And I just wanted to touch on one more current study that we're working on in speech in Down syndrome. We're working with a speech-language pathologist, Harrison Jones, who's doing a study investigating the speech characteristics in Down syndrome. I know there's a lot of interest in speech therapy development in Down syndrome. So his study, he had 3 speech-language pathologists did a rating of children's speech and different speech features in Down syndrome. And so his results have shown that there's involvement of multiple different speech mechanisms in Down syndrome. So this is going to be really important for development of future targeted speech therapies. So he's in the process of publishing this data right now. And he is also doing a speech intervention study. So his intervention is really focusing on speech articulation and using clear speech. So he has currently enrolled a few kids in this study, and I think he may be looking to enroll one more at this point, but it's kind of wrapping up soon. And then finally, just wanted to give a few points on where we're going in the future. So certainly our goals are to get larger groups of participants. We'll be investigating new interventions and certainly having really thoughtfully designed study measures. It will also be important, the previous studies all have included individuals who communicate verbally, and in the future it'll be important to also include individuals who have minimal verbal skills, because some of these kids may also really benefit from some of these medications. Also modifying some of our study measures to make them more engaging, being a little more flexible to do things like including increased practice time and things like that will be helpful. The new research will be incorporating some new technologies. So Lena Pro is a technology for recording audio communication. So it can be used to record speech more in a natural environment in the home. And certainly using things like iPads can be helpful in getting kids a little more engaged in the research procedures. And as I mentioned before, being able to try to look for some of these subgroups of individuals who are responders to the medications will certainly be important, and having larger samples is really critical to be able to do that. So I just want to acknowledge the many different members of our research team who have worked on these studies, particular Dr. Gail Spiradigliozzi right there is our team psychologist, and she administers the majority of these cognitive measures in our studies. And then Wan Lan Lang is a clinical research coordinator in our group who works very closely with our families who participate in the drug trials. So I've included our contact information here with our email addresses. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at any time with any questions, and we're happy to talk with anybody later on if you have any questions. Thank you.
Before you sit down, though, I know we're out of time, but can you take 1 minute to kind of address Vicki's question about how your consents are worded differently when you're consenting individuals with intellectual disabilities?
I missed that question before.
How you're wording your informed consent differently or presenting it differently when you're incorporating individuals with intellectual disabilities in your studies?
Sure. So in terms of the IRB process, that's something that's reviewed very closely when we're developing consent forms. And so Dr. Spence talked about the informed consent procedure. So it's just very important that our participants are very aware, of all of the potential benefits and risks to being in a study. So the IRB really reviews very closely the wording that we use. So things might just be targeted toward like a lower reading level or things like that, to make sure that we're using language that can be really well understood by the participants. And the research scientist who's involved in the consent process, it's also our job to make sure that our participants do have a good understanding of that. And some techniques that can be used can be to kind of ask families or participants to explain to us, what do you think is going to be happening in the study, or do you have any questions about that? And things like that are some of the techniques that we use. Yeah. And Jane Ann does a lot of our consenting as well.
I was just going to say quickly, at Duke, if you're 12 to 17, the child actually has to sign an assent. Which is a little different than a consent, because if they have intellectual difficulties, they can't actually sign a consent, but they can do an assent saying, it has been explained to me, I understand, and I do want to participate. We also have, the child has the ability to stop a study as well as a parent. That's important to us. If we feel that a child who has given an assent decides that they don't want to participate anymore, that's something that, we have to respect. For the Roche trials, they're actually requiring an assent for the 6 to 11-year-olds as well. So, we do take that into consideration. Obviously, once you're no longer a minor, it's a whole different ball game of, determining who is, if there's legal guardianship, if there's not, that, we could spend an hour talking about that. But for the 17 and under the minors, we are required to explain the procedure to them and include them in the process.
So does that mean that children with more delayed verbal skills or understanding would not be able then to participate?
No, not at all. We just, part of it is our PI. We actually have a form when we have a child who is, maybe their understanding isn't to the point where we could even get a yes or no. Then the PI, actually, we have a form that they can review to see whether or not that they feel that the child is a willing participant to this process in their clinical judgment. So, and believe me, we have people in our staff at the DCRU who keep us honest in this all the time, because if they feel that children are, resisting to a particular procedure, and it's at the point where it's harmful to the child, we'll stop. Even if a parent is saying, I think he'll do it, I think he'll do it, there's a point where, we also step in and say, we want this to be a positive process for you and your child. So, we may suggest at that point that it's not working well for the family.
Do you have any special visual programs, let's say on an iPad?
We do. We now use an e-consent, and there's a specific video for kids.
Thank you.